Hi there. This is Colin and Addis podcast dedicated to 50 years of oil trading. We have written a book called The Rivers of Money, Social and Economic History of Modern Oil Trading. And that gave us an idea to use a lot of material that we didn't actually end up using in the book to probably start a podcast, bring some people that have not been featuring in the book, some people who have, and maybe expand on some of the discussions that book wasn't big enough to contain, and basically dedicate this podcast to growth and development of a very, very unique market, which is the oil market. So this is our first podcast, and Colin and I will just today, and today is 24th of September, 2025, we're just going to introduce some of the topics that we are probably likely to talk about. So, Colin, I guess the early days of the oil trading were quite interesting. There wasn't much going on. It was just optimizing endless swaps between oil majors.
Yeah, I think it was balancing, if you like, on the margin. There was certainly buying and there was selling, but I recall when we interviewed Richard Johnson, one of the folks who was there right at the start, he said, of course, it was nothing like oil trading, nothing like trading. And, you know, there's a book that was written way back in I guess it was probably the 1960s, Adventures in Oil, about BP and how it was formed and et cetera, et cetera. And it runs through 250 or 300 pages, and there's not a single mention of trading in that whole book. So, you know, it just wasn't really something that happened at that
That's
stage.
quite That's quite incredible and very, very interesting. I remember we interviewed Robin Burley as well, who was in bulk supply department of BP. In those days, there was no trading departments, of course. And he was telling us actually why that happened. It actually makes a lot of sense. He said in the 60s, when he started, late 60s, oil was $10, $30, and freight per barrel was far, far more expensive. So it didn't make sense to try and make money on trading oil. It made a lot more sense to get the logistics right and get freight savings, and then you can make millions basically just by doing so. The other interesting thing, Colin, was I thought we use in this book a lot of narrative rather than statistics. I think that the oil market and statistics have been used already plenty, and some of them are actually quite poor for those early days. So, in terms of showing the importance of the oil market in those early days, I thought one of the best narratives was when we spoke to Junichi Kasahara, who was the head of Fibro in Singapore. When he started as a young crude oil operator in Tokyo, he started in Fibro, probably one of the greatest oil companies of all times. And in the mid 80s, Fibro didn't have an oil department. He started in a department called Miscellaneous Commodities Department, which I think says quite a bit of the story. Later on, of course, they got Marcus Green of Arcadia. He came from BP to Tokyo and started a proper oil department, which kind of leads me to our discussion. We spent a lot of time on a number of people and interviewed a number of people from BP in those old days, and the importance the company played in those early days.
Yeah, no, they were right there in the early days. Just maybe before we go on to have a chat a little bit about that, you know, one of the things I found most interesting in writing this book with you and doing the research was getting involved in what was known as the Rotterdam spot market in the early days. And there's surprisingly little written out there about that. And you really have to rely on interviewing folks who are still with us, happily, and who were there at the time. And, you know, it really was that Rotterdam spot market that, you know, represented the first seeds of trading. It was based in Rotterdam, I suppose, in the very early stages. You know, Rotterdam is a kind of place of locational geography perfection. It's got a wonderful hinterland down into Germany and Switzerland. It's close to Scandinavia and just across the water from the UK. Huge market, lovely piece of flat land to build refineries, and a wonderful river, the Rhine, that runs away down through that hinterland. And oil products trading started there. The marginal barrel, as we talked about earlier, that the majors didn't really want to deal with and didn't mind someone else dealing with, and you've got a bunch of companies, setting up to deal with that marginal barrel. And there was also, as Adi said, the need to refine crude oil as close to the place of production as possible, and that place at that time was the Mediterranean, and a whole bunch of refineries were built up in the Mediterranean. The products were then produced and taken up to Rotterdam for distribution down the Rhine and across to Scandinavia. And so Rotterdam became very much the entrepot, much like New York Harbor was, and I suppose the Mediterranean equivalent in the US would have been the Caribbean, where the products were refined and came up to New York. That was where trading started. And it was a very interesting development because prices were rising. Small companies could get into the business. They could buy something one day, sell it the next day, totally unsophisticated, and make some money. And off the business went. But you talked about BP, and they've been a really interesting company over time. Going back to the time when the British National Oil Corporation was being set up. BP were, of course, Britain's supposedly national oil company, although they were primarily a private company. And they had a lot of things going on at that time that they didn't really want the British National Oil Corporation to interfere in. And so they were whispering in the ears of government and officials and trying their best to hamstring anything that BNOC were doing. And they did that pretty successfully. And I remember right at the very end of the whole process when BNOC were finally in their demise, and BP had taken over the rump, which was known as Britoil. One of the directors of BP, Basil Butler, made this wonderful comment when he said that the British National Oil Corporation would have been an absolutely wonderful idea had Britain been a banana republic. And it was typical of arrogance of BP at the time. Yet, they have been the company who have produced the top people who have gone on to great things in wider UK business. You think of people like Tufan Erginbilgic, currently CEO of Rolls-Royce, who was a trader at BP, Brian Gilvary, chairman of Ineos Energy, trader at BP. Way back to Ian Conn, who was CEO at Centrica, Andy Duff, chaired Severn Water Company, etc., etc. They managed somehow to educate their people or train their people in a way that became very appealing to wider UK industry, and in a way that executives, I suppose, from Shell, Exxon, Mobil, and others didn't seem to be trained, and certainly didn't follow that route. So, big influence BP had right from the very early days.
Absolutely, and there was this great cross-pollination between, first of all, majors, Shell and BP in particular, were big suppliers of traders, and later on, Total Elf, to top trading oil companies, like in those days, Mark Rich, Fibro, Andy Hall, arguably the best oil trader ever of all times, went to Fibro as well. So we've got a number of people that we interviewed, and we talked to them in the book. But it was interesting, there was also cross-pollination across the Atlantic. Like Andy went to the US, but we also had a number of people over here in the UK. And London was the place to be as well for very, very special reason. I mean, the obvious reasons were sort of the cross-pollination, again, political one between Reagan and Thatcher, and those were the years that really helped, that coincided with the crises in OPEC, where OPEC in the mid 60s were really struggling to control the oil market, to control the prices, and price volatility grew up. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute because that's when the banks came in. But I just want to briefly focus on London and London crowd. One of the great stories that I think we sort of wrote about in detail in the book was how the 15-day Brent market started at Chez Gerard in Dover Street. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think when I talked to David Houghton, who was the head of the PVM brokerage business and very influential person in helping getting trading going in the way that it did. He told me that a bunch of folks used to lunch at a small brasserie in Dover Street called Chez Gerard, and it was over an extended, and they usually were extended lunch there that they came up with the idea, a number of them, of creating a tradable market, given that there was a whole bunch of oil out there having been discovered in the North Sea that was free and open for sale. And initially they created something called the Brent Ninian 40s market, where, with 15 days notice, a seller could determine which one of the three he was going to give to his buyer. And that very quickly morphed to the 15-day Brent market. And that then exploded into a movement of people and companies, and there were jobs all over the place, and didn't really matter whether people were any good at them or not. And I recall in the discussions we had with Andy Whitrow, who was a trader in these days, he said at the time, oil traders are like football managers. They fail, but someone always wants to hire them. So it was just a wonderful time, and there was a movement, and it was based in Mayfair, and folks were having a great ride, and it was easy for those who were there.
Yes, I was actually going to read something out of the book about London, but I think we'll probably run out of time, so I'll leave it for the next time. I think the great one about London that sort of brings out the best of London, I think, and what London community was the IP week. So second week in February every year, there would be International Petroleum Exchange Week. That was organized every year. Now it's been taken over by S&P Global, so it's called International Energy Week. Like most things, we're going away from fossil fuel names, but amongst a lot of old industry hands, we still call it IP International Petroleum Week, IP Week. So, and that lasted for what? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Usually people, I remember, Colin would come on Sunday. I remember the big deal was on Sunday we would go to the Grenadier. It was, I think, Malcolm McAvity from Fibro would usually get a whole crowd around him, and then it would be drinking basically most of Sunday afternoon. Good introduction into Monday, and then it would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday would be pretty brutal with a lot of meetings, but mainly cocktail parties and drinking.
Yeah, well, very and in fine dining and places as well, and the top spots in Mayfair, and yeah, it was an arduous week, I seem to recall.
Yeah.
And but always great fun, and I think probably these days it's a lot more serious and staid. It certainly was neither serious nor staid back in the back in
Absolutely.
the 1980s. But of course, when all this was happening, Addy, let's not forget, how can we, that in 1983, the New York Mercantile Exchange contract for WTI started trading, and that was a really seminal event in the development of trading and traded markets. Much credit goes to Michael Marks, who got the NYMEX up on its feet again after a disaster earlier on, and NYMEX became the place where the price of oil was set. I mean,
Yep.
you came into the office in London, and when NYMEX opened, it set the price, and Brent followed. It was it's always that way in these days, and so. I suppose the big thing in many ways in terms of the development of the market post the establishment of NYMEX was that it encouraged a group of companies called the Wall Street refiners, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Drexel, Burnham Lambert, and Bear Stearns in the early stages. It encouraged them to come into the market and use the market in the way that they used metals markets or agricultural markets to offer price risk management to their clients who had a price risk at the market interface, and so they then had a big effect on the market, and they speculated as well, and they were very over a long period of time.
Yeah, thank you for that. We had a little minor technical connection glitch, but hopefully it won't be very, very serious. Well, before we get too serious about banks, because we discuss in a lot of detail in the book the relationship between JR and Morgan Stanley, just as an example of different approaches to the market. I just wanted to go a little bit more to the sort of brighter side of things, and because we were trying in the book to sort of bring some characters out, and I really love this bit that I'll have to read for you about Wall Street from the chapter 7 of the book, Wall Street Warriors. Even in the days of ex-New York crime buster Major Rudolph Giuliani, strolling around cities' parks after dark was not to be recommended. Sympathize with J. Aaron, old trader Tom Walcott. J. Aaron was, by the way, Goldman Sachs trading company, who often covered London trading hours from New York, and whose 2:30 a.m. journey to work at their Broad Street office involved a dark and dangerous walk through Battery Park. Unsurprising then, when removing his jacket on arrival at his desk, he was seen to be fully holstered and tooled up. More surprisingly, though, when he opened his briefcase, generally used by the investment banking types as a posh sandwich carrier, one encountered a serious armory of items that would provide more than useful in the event of not just a skirmish on the way to work, but a full-blown coup d'etat. Of course, it wouldn't happen today, not even in Texas. I thought it was a great introduction to the Wall Street Warriors chapter, which then, of course, gets a lot more sort of analytical and serious, but we kind of, I was hoping we'll miss too serious a side of this and move on to maybe the other side that we covered a lot in this book with 2+ chapters, which is the Asian side of the business. So obviously the trading, I mentioned Junichi Kasahara, Fibro, Tokyo, but very, very quickly the sort of market moved away from Tokyo for a number of reasons that we discuss, and moved to Singapore. Singapore had a government that was very committed to attracting traders into the city. Already there were several refineries. Most of all, there was the biggest and most important was a Shell refinery. And in fact, the history of Shell is very closely related to Singapore. And in those days, if you remember, there was a bit of a glut of oil in the market in the mid-60s. There was a lot of volatility in prices. And there was an excess capacity in refining, particularly following the end of the Vietnam War. That obviously Vietnam was a big draw for products demand there for the US troops while the war was being waged. So there was what actually helped development of trading a lot in those days was that excess capacity, because then traders had optionality on both sides. They could source crudes wherever it was cheapest, have it processed in one of the refineries in Singapore, and then have the products delivered to pretty much anywhere they want. And I quite liked when we talked to John Driscoll, who was trading at the time in Singapore, and he had a processing deal with Shell. And interestingly enough, the person in charge of processing at Shell at the time was Ian Taylor of the VTOL fame. And I love the line when John says something like, "Well, I'm not going to read this, so listeners can read that themselves." But something along the lines, Ian's line was, "Look, if you're doing processing in Singapore, you're going to get screwed. Shell will screw you less than anyone else. And that was his basically sales pitch. And I thought it was excellent. And in general, I think, there was the time when brokers sort of started setting up their shops in Singapore. We interviewed a number of them. It was great to see, for example, Paul Clausen, who started with PVM and then moved on to Amerex. It was one of the key players together with Scotty Brown. All the social side of it, I think we've covered very, very well in the book. With some restaurants like Da Paulo, where pretty much trading was happening. It was a little bit Chez Gerard of Singapore for a number of years. And Paul Clausen, I remember, was interesting when he started. It was so amateurish in those days. He said he was working for an Australian company that was trying to finance some property purchases. The company went belly up, and he didn't have any money. He didn't have money to go back to Australia. He's from Perth. So he interviewed with PVM, and apparently the interview went something like this. For about half an hour, he was told, he basically gave his name. He was told how bad all the brokers were by the management. They were just terrible. They can't make any money. Market is terrible. Everything is really, really bad. So, Paul, if you can do any better than this, you've got a job. And Paul said, I was just sitting there. I just gave them my name, said nothing, and I already had a job. That was quite a way to go. So I guess those were the days.
Yeah, no, indeed. And you had much more experience of Singapore and the Far East than I did, but I do remember trying on one occasion to have a run round the Singapore Botanical Gardens and ending up with heat exhaustion halfway around. And when I poured a bottle of water over my head, it fizzed like a kettle boiling. That's strange the things you remember, but there we go.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I'll just mention this, a lot of people sort of think about hubs, trading hubs, in terms of, a lot of, okay, tax is always very important, but in terms of infrastructure and trading infrastructure, one very important thing that a lot of people forget is a family. Once I was interviewed, I remember, by a very young journalist from Financial Times, and she asked me, why is Singapore an oil trading hub? And I said, well, you're talking to the wrong person. You should be talking to my wife. And she said, why? She was young and single. She didn't get it. But a great thing about Singapore at the time, and I lived there for almost 14 years and worked there, was that my wife loved it. Schools were excellent. There was a great British school, there was a great American school, there was a great German school, there was a great Canadian school. Okay, you could have, wives had maids because maids were rather cheap and very helpful, of course, with bringing up children. Cafes and restaurants were plentiful and really, really good. And life was great, for the family, for the whole family. So you could go to work as a trader and not worry about your wife and family, how they're getting on. It was great. And of course, the language was very, very helpful as well. Everyone spoke English.
Very interesting. Place. We talk a lot in the book about people and the influence of people, but place is terribly important as well. And there you have an example of place, because it was somewhere that your wife might like, and the development of trading is all about places, whether that place be the floor of the New York Mercantile Exchange, Mayfair, Singapore, or Rotterdam. It's people and places that have come together to, develop this market, this social construct, which we've loved researching and talking about. And actually, I suppose, thinking about people, I'm reminded of a quote that I got from Mark Crandall. Mark Crandall was one of the folks who he worked for Mark Rich, and he was one of the founders of Trafigura, and he made this quote about Mark Rich when he said that Mark never judged a deal. He only judged the people who brought him the deal. And I think that's a particularly important aspect of everything you can read in this book. It's all about people and the judgment that people make. Perhaps these days tech has become a little bit more relevant. Certainly has. It wasn't relevant back in the day, but I think we argue very strongly that no matter the importance of tech and data, markets are social constructs primarily and remain so.
Absolutely, and I think that line from Mark Rich, whether you love him or hate him, is the key to everything, because we finish. I think just before I say go to the epilogue, we do talk about Mark Rich quite a bit, and because he was absolutely the key. But I think we cover some material that hasn't been published before, which is basically creation of the other companies. We talk about creation of JNS, and then Marco and Danny's Mercuria. We talk about obviously some other smaller companies. Vitol was inevitable to talk about as well. But we try to cover the angles that haven't been covered so far, mainly coming from various interviews. At the end of the day, you're right. We discuss in one of the last chapters about paper boys, the modern trading, the algos, black boxes, provision of liquidity. We try and explain why this provisional liquidity was so important, because after the financial crisis, banks obviously got out of that business, and there was a big gap to be filled. And of course, a trader from Morgan Stanley came in and filled in the gap originally with Mandara, and then a whole bunch of other companies that sort of followed him. But at the end of the day, however technical the market is, longer term deals, the physical oil, there are always issues. One of the most remarkable things about the oil market is that we've had all these crises, just to mention the last two, which were the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, and 2022 invasion of Ukraine, with everything that happened in between. We've never run out of oil. There were never any shortages, and that's primarily thanks to traders and trading communities. And these are the people who we have written this book about, and we wanted to show, as you rightly say, Colin, that that market is not some entity out there that lives on its own. When people say market goes long, market goes short, market is a bunch of very, very hard-working people like you and I that actually try and make things happen. Yes, driven by a bit of greed, by profit, but once when channeled, I think absolutely essential for the workings of the modern society. So this would be the end of our introduction. Colin, I think we can promise that we are going to talk a lot more about sort of these aspects of trading with people who are actually there, who made it happen. We'll bring them here to our show,
Yeah,
and we are going to keep it fairly loose, probably at the beginning once a month, and then we'll probably make it more frequent if and when need be. And I just hope that everybody enjoys it.
yeah. Hopefully they do. I think we've tried very hard to make the book readable, mildly amusing, semi-academic with the accent on semi, I think perhaps. Um,
Absolutely.
but yeah, there's a fun side to the market. There always was a fun side to the market. There's also a seriousness of purpose, and we will try and we've tried to bring that out in the book, and we'll try and bring that out in the podcasts as they develop. Addy,
We'll definitely do both. Thank you very much, Colin. Thanks everyone for listening.
cheers.
Take care. Bye.